The Ferrari had been at 4 different shops in 3 states before it arrived at the end of Nathan Cole's driveway on a flatbed truck on a Tuesday morning in September. Nathan was sitting on his front porch at 7:15 with his coffee when the truck pulled up. He had been expecting it. He had not been expecting the woman who got out of the black SUV behind it. She was perhaps 35, in clothes that did not belong in the specific residential neighborhood of Murfreesboro, Tennessee, where Nathan lived, not because they were wrong, exactly, but because they were the clothes of someone accustomed to a different kind of Tuesday morning than this one. Dark trousers, a cream blouse, the specific shoes that communicated expense without announcing it. She had dark hair and the composed expression of someone who had been managing a frustrating situation for a long time and had developed, through the managing of it, a very precise idea of what she was willing to accept from the next person she spoke to. She looked at the house. She looked at the single-car garage with the door up, which contained the specific, organized evidence of someone who worked on cars seriously. The tool chest, the lift he had installed 3 years ago, the pegboard with the outlines of every tool in its designated place. She looked at Nathan on the porch. She said, "Mr. Cole?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Vivian Hartley." She said it with the directness of someone who did not follow their name with a title because the name was sufficient. She said, "I called last week." He said, "I remember." He stood. He said, "The 488 Pista." She said, "Yes." He said, "Come look at it with me." He walked down from the porch to the truck. The flatbed was lowering the Ferrari onto the driveway, a red 488 Pista that was in the condition a car worth close to $400,000 should be in if the only problem with it were the specific intermittent failure that had, by any account Vivian had given him on the phone, completely mystified 4 shops and 6 independent Ferrari specialists over the course of 4 months. He walked around it. He looked at it without touching it. He looked at it the way he looked at all cars, not at the surface, at the shape of the thing underneath. He crouched at the front. He stood. He walked around to the driver's side. He looked at the door sill. He looked at the rear. She said, "The shops all started with the ECU." He said, "I know." He said it without looking at her. He was still looking at the car. She said, "4 different shops, 2 of them Ferrari certified." She said, "They've replaced the ECU twice." She said, "They've replaced the throttle body." She said, "The ignition coils." She said, "The fuel injectors on 3 cylinders." She said, "The car runs for between 40 minutes and 3 hours and then cuts out completely." She said, "No warning." She said, "No codes thrown." She said, "It restarts after approximately 20 minutes." He said, "What were you doing when it first happened?" She said, "I was on the interstate." She said, 80 miles an hour. She said, "The engine cut completely." He said, "And after that?" She said, "It happened 7 times in the first 2 weeks." She said, "Then the shop replaced the ECU." She said, "It happened twice more." She said, "They replaced it again." She said, "It happened 4 more times." She said, "The specialists flew in from Atlanta and from the regional Ferrari service center in Charlotte." She said, "They could not replicate it in controlled conditions." She said, "The car behaved perfectly in the shop." She said, "On the road, it failed." He said, "How long does it take to cut out after you start driving?" She said, "Variable." She said, "Shortest was 38 minutes." She said, "Longest was 3 hours and 12 minutes." She said, "No pattern that anyone has found." He said, "It always restarts after 20 minutes?" She said, "Between 18 and 22. She said, "Consistently." He nodded. He was looking at the undercarriage now. He said, "Who told you about me?" She said, "A man named Gil Porter." She said, "He said you fixed a problem with his Porsche GT3 that 2 shops in Nashville couldn't find." He said, "The oil cooler bypass was triggering a thermal protection shutdown." He said it looking at the undercarriage. He said, "Nobody checked the bypass valve because the oil temps read normal." He said, "They were reading normal because the bypass was open and the cooler wasn't working." She said, "You found it by feel." He said, "I found it because I drove it for 40 minutes and then put my hand on the oil cooler housing." He said it was cold. He said should have been warm. She said, you drove it. He said, that's usually the right way to find things that only happen when you drive. He said it with the patience of someone who found this obvious and had learned not to say so directly. She said, the Ferrari shops drove it. He said, briefly. He stood up from the undercarriage inspection. He said, how briefly? She said, one of them drove it for 20 minutes. She said, the others used a test bench. He said, that's the problem. He said it simply. He said, not the only problem. He said, but that's the first problem. She said, you haven't looked at anything yet. He said, I've looked at it for 6 minutes. He said, I have a theory. He said, I need to drive it for 45 minutes and then I'll know if the theory is right. He said, would you like coffee while you wait? She looked at him. She said, you have a theory after 6 minutes? He said, I have a starting point after 6 minutes. He said, I'll have a theory after the drive. She said, the 4 shops had the car for a combined 11 weeks. He said, I know. He said, coffee? She said, yes. She said it with the quality of someone who had accepted an unusual situation and had decided to allow it. She said, thank you. He brought 2 coffees out to the porch. His daughter, Sophie, was at school. She was 7 and started at 8:15, and he had dropped her off an hour ago. He had until 3:30 before pickup, which was not enough time if the problem was complex, but was enough time if the theory was right, and he thought the theory was right. He sat on the porch steps with her coffee and watched him pull the Ferrari into the garage. He watched him spend 20 minutes on a detailed inspection. He was methodical in the way of someone who had a system for how to look at a car and trusted the system. He did not skip steps. He did not rush to the thing he suspected. He went through the exterior, the undercarriage, the engine bay, the interior in a sequence that was the same sequence every time. He came out of the garage. He picked up his coffee from the porch railing where he had left it. He said, okay. She said, what's the theory? He said, the fuel pump driver module is failing under specific thermal and load conditions. He said it looking at the car in the garage. He said, not the fuel pump. He said, the driver module. He said, it's a component that manages the pump speed based on demand. He said, when the module fails, it cuts fuel delivery. He said, the engine management system sees a fuel pressure drop and cuts the engine to protect it. He said, no codes because the module doesn't report its own failure. He said, the ECU throws nothing because from the ECU's perspective, the engine was shut down correctly. He said, the system did what it was supposed to. He said, the module failure isn't visible in the diagnostic because the diagnostic talks to the module. She said, you're saying the diagnostic was talking to the failed component. He said, the diagnostic was talking to a component that behaved normally stationary and under low load. He said, the module fails at sustained high RPM under thermal load. He said, you drive it for a while, the engine bay heats up, the load conditions hit a specific threshold, and the module stops regulating the pump correctly. She said, why doesn't it happen in the shop? He said, because in the shop they're running the engine at low RPM in controlled temperature. He said, the module never reaches the thermal state that triggers the failure. She said, why does it restart after 20 minutes? He said, because in 20 minutes the engine bay cools enough that the module comes back to normal operating temperature. He said, it's a thermal failure. He said, heat takes it out. He said, cooling brings it back. She said, 4 shops and 6 specialists. He said, missed the module because the module is a subcomponent that the diagnostic treats as reliable. He said, Ferrari engineering assumes the fuel pump driver module is not the failure point because it almost never is. He said, so nobody looked for it. He said, they replaced everything around it. She said, how did you know to look for it? He said, I didn't. He said it with the specific honesty of someone who was not trying to be impressive. He said, I knew the pattern. He said, intermittent failure at sustained RPM, restarts after cooling, no codes. He said, that's a thermal failure. He said, either electrical or mechanical. He said, the mechanical components had all been replaced. He said, that left electrical. She said, the thermal electrical failures in high-performance engines are almost always in driver modules because driver modules are the interface between the ECU and the physical components, and they run hot. She said, that's logical. He said, it's sequence. He said it looking at the car. He said, you eliminate what it isn't and what's left is what it is. He said, the 4 shops eliminated the obvious things. He said, I'm trying the next obvious thing. She said, you said you had to drive it first. He said, to confirm. He said, I want to drive it until it cuts out. He said, when it cuts out, I'm going to put a thermal probe on the module immediately. He said, if the module is running significantly hotter than spec at the point of failure, the theory is confirmed. She said, and if it's not? He said, then I'm wrong and we go back to looking. He said it without defensiveness. He said, I don't think I'm wrong. He said, but I could be wrong. She said, the other shops were confident. He said, the other shops were confident about specific things they checked. He said there's a difference between confidence about a component you tested and confidence about the problem. He said you can be completely right about what you tested and completely wrong about what the problem is. She looked at him. She said, how long have you been doing this? He said, working on cars? He said, since I was 11. He said, professionally, 12 years. He said, on my own, 4. She said, why your own? He said, Sophie. He said it with the simplicity that he always used when the answer was her. He said, she was 3. He said, her mother and I split, and I had her the majority of the time, and the shop I was working at had hours that didn't work. He said, I built this instead. He said, it works better around the schedule. She said, what schedule? He said, school. He said, pickup. He said the Tuesday violin lesson. He said Thursday she has a reading group. He said, I need to be available at those times regardless of what the car requires. She said, most shops aren't available at those times. He said, most shops don't have a 7-year-old with a Tuesday violin lesson. He said it with the specific quality of someone who had organized their entire professional life around a specific person and found the organization entirely reasonable. She said, what happens if a job runs long? He said, I finish it at 8 after she's in bed, or I come back to it the next morning. He said, the cars wait. He said, she doesn't. She said, the cars wait? He said, the cars are cars. He said it looking at the garage. He said, they'll be here. He said, she's 7 for 11 more months. She looked at the garage. She said, Mr. Cole. He said, Nathan. She said, Nathan. She said it with the acceptance of someone moving from formal to something else. She said, why did you take this? He said, the car? She said, the job. She said, a $400,000 Ferrari from a woman you've never met who tells you 4 shops couldn't fix it. She said, most people would have reasons not to touch it. He said, I took it because the problem sounded interesting. He said it with the specific quality of someone for whom this was genuinely sufficient. He said the intermittent no-code failure on a high-performance engine is a specific kind of problem. He said it requires thinking about the system rather than the components. He said, I like that kind of problem. She said, you like problems? He said, I like problems that reward the right kind of thinking. He said it looking at the Ferrari. He said, most problems do if you find the right approach. She said, what's the right approach to this one? He said, drive it until it fails and put a thermal probe where the problem should be. He said, then fix what the probe confirms. He said, simple. She said, not simple. She said, 4 shops, 6 specialists. He said, simple is not the same as easy. He said, the approach is simple. He said, finding it was hard because the approach 4 other shops used was looking at the components the diagnostic indicated. He said, that approach was thorough and correct and didn't find the problem. He said, a different approach was needed. She said, what made you try a different approach without the diagnostic telling you to? He said, because the diagnostic had already been done 4 times and it hadn't found anything. He said it with the patience he brought to things that were logical. He said, if the standard approach hasn't worked 4 times, the standard approach isn't finding the thing. He said, that means the thing isn't where the standard approach is looking. He said, so you look somewhere else. She said, that sounds obvious. He said, it is obvious. He said, most obvious things are hard to do in practice. He got in the Ferrari at 7:49 and drove north on the county road out of Murfreesboro toward the stretch of Route 70 that had a long straight with enough distance to sustain high RPM for an extended period. He drove it the way he drove problem cars, not carefully, not timidly, at the pace the car was designed for, because the pace was where the problem lived, and you couldn't find the problem if you refused to go where it was. He had the thermal probe with Bluetooth output on the passenger seat. He had set up the monitoring app on his phone. He drove. The car was extraordinary in the way that very good things were extraordinary when you engaged with them at their actual capability, responsive and precise in a way that produced a specific kind of attention in the driver, the attention of someone operating at the edge of their skill rather than comfortably inside it. He drove north. The September Tennessee morning was clear and specific, the light at 7:50 and the particular quality of the early hour before it became the day's light. He maintained the RPM in the sustained high range. He watched the thermal probe readout on his phone, which was mounted on the dash where the previous owner had apparently kept the navigation device. The engine bay temperature climbed in the normal curve. He watched the module temperature. At 33 minutes, the module temperature showed a spike, not a gradual increase, a spike, the specific signature of a component that was beginning to intermittently fail at thermal load. At 38 minutes, the engine cut out. He coasted to the shoulder. He picked up the thermal probe and held it to the fuel pump driver module housing before the engine bay had time to begin cooling. The probe read 111 degrees Celsius. Spec was 94. He sat in the car on the shoulder of Route 70 in the September morning. He said, "There you are." He said it quietly, with the specific satisfaction of someone who had looked for something in the right place and found it. He called her. She answered on the first ring. He said, "Module is running at 112. Spec is 94. He said, "It's the fuel pump driver module." She said, "You found it in 40 minutes. He said, 38. He said, "I'll be back in 20 when it restarts." She said, "Mr. Cole." He said, "Nathan." She said, "Nathan." She said it differently than before. She said, "I've been sitting on this porch for 40 minutes, and I've been thinking about something." She said, "Can I tell you what I've been thinking about?" He said, go ahead. She said, you said the approach was simple, but the doing of it was hard. She said, what I've been thinking about is why the other 4 shops didn't try the approach. He said, what have you been thinking? She said that they were all too good. She said it with the specific quality of someone who had arrived at a conclusion that surprised them. She said they were all Ferrari certified or Ferrari specialists or both. She said they had the best equipment and the most relevant training for this specific car. She said, and that expertise told them where the problem had to be, which meant they stopped looking anywhere else. He said, yes. She said, you don't specialize in Ferrari. He said, I specialize in problems. He said it looking at the road. He said, Ferrari is a car. He said, it has systems. He said, the systems have logic. He said, the logic can be followed. She said, the specialists knew too much. He said, the specialists knew Ferrari. He said, I know cars. He said, there's a specific kind of advantage in not knowing the thing so well that you know what the answer has to be. He said, if you know what the answer has to be, you stop looking for the answer the evidence is pointing to. He said, you're looking for confirmation of what you already know. She said, and you weren't looking for confirmation. He said, I was looking for the thing. He said, no expectations about where it was. He said, just, here's the symptom pattern. Where does this pattern live in this kind of system? He said, the pattern pointed somewhere nobody had looked. She said, Nathan? He said, yeah. She said, I run a company. She said it with the quality of someone contextualizing themselves. She said, I run a financial technology company in Nashville. She said, 90 employees. She said, we build payment infrastructure for mid-sized retailers. She said, I've been running it for 8 years. He said, okay. She said, we've had a problem for 6 months that I have not been able to solve. She said, similar pattern. She said, intermittent. She said, no error codes. She said, the specialists I've brought in have not found it. She said, they've replaced the components the diagnostic indicated. He said, the diagnostic was talking to the failed component. She said, I think so. She said, yes. She said, but it's not code. She said, it's organizational. She said, a process failure that shows up intermittently under specific load conditions and that I can't replicate in controlled review. He said, what does it do when it fails? She said, it produces incorrect reconciliation in the payment processing layer. She said, not always. She said, not in any pattern the auditors have found. She said, under high transaction volume with specific combinations of retailer type and transaction category, the reconciliation throws errors. She said, the errors are small. She said, small enough that most of them are caught in the review layer. She said, not all of them. He said, the ones that aren't. She said, have cost us 2 client relationships and are going to cost us a 3rd if I don't find the problem in the next 6 weeks. She said it with the controlled quality of someone reporting a crisis they have been managing for a long time. She said, I've had 4 audit firms in. She said, 3 technology consultants. She said, my own engineering team has been working on it for 3 months. She said, nobody has found the source. He said, because they're looking where the diagnostic points. She said, yes. She said, I think so. She said, that's what I've been sitting here thinking about for 40 minutes. She said that the problem in the Ferrari and the problem in my company have the same shape. She said they both fail under specific load conditions. She said they both restart after a period. She said the diagnostic for both talks to the component that's failing rather than around it. He said, what's the equivalent of the fuel pump driver module in your system? She was quiet for a moment. She said, I don't know. She said it with the honesty of someone who had been looking from the inside for too long. She said, that's what I can't see. She said, I'm too close to it. He said, when does the reconciliation fail specifically? She said, high volume. She said, specific retailer types. She said, combination of transaction categories. She said, our engineers say the logic is correct. She said, the auditors say the controls are correct. She said, everyone has looked at the components and they're correct. He said, then the problem isn't in the components. She said, that's where I've arrived. She said, after 6 months. She said, that's where I've arrived. He said, the problem is in the interface between components. He said it looking at the road. He said, the component that manages the handoff between the elements everyone has checked. He said, the thing nobody looked at because the components on both sides of it checked out. She said, the driver module? He said, the equivalent of it. He said, something that translates between two systems that both test correctly when isolated. She was quiet. He could hear her thinking in the quality of the silence. She said, the mapping layer. He said, what's the mapping layer? She said, it's the component that translates between our internal transaction categorization and the retailer's categorization system. She said, when a transaction comes in from a retailer, it gets mapped from their category codes to our codes before reconciliation. She said, the mapping is done by a component that sits between intake and reconciliation. She said, everyone has tested intake. She said, everyone has tested reconciliation. Nobody has looked at the mapper. He said, why not? She said, because the mapper tests correctly in isolation. She said, you give it a transaction, it returns the correct mapping. She said, it's been tested hundreds of times. She said, it always tests correctly. He said, in controlled conditions. She said, in controlled conditions. She said it with the specific quality of someone hearing the echo of what she had said 40 minutes ago about the Ferrari in the shop. She said, under low volume. He said, under high volume with specific combinations of retailer type and transaction category. She said, it might fail. She said, under those conditions specifically. She said, because the mapping table has been growing. She said, we add retailers constantly. The mapping table has 3 times as many entries as it did 2 years ago. She said, under high concurrent volume with certain category combinations, the mapper might be, he said, running hot. She said, running hot. She said it with the recognition of someone who had found the right metaphor for something she had been trying to describe. She said, the lookup is hitting a performance threshold under load. She said, it's returning an incorrect mapping on a small percentage of transactions when the load exceeds the threshold. She said, because the test environment never reaches the load the production system hits under peak volume. He said, the shop never drove it fast enough. She said, the shop never drove it fast enough. She said, Nathan? She looked at the garage. She said, you found 2 problems before your coffee got cold. He said, I haven't finished the coffee. He said, I left it on the railing. She said, it's cold now. He said, probably. He said, the car is about to restart. He said, I'll be back in 5. He drove back to the house. She was standing in the driveway when he pulled in. She said, the mapping layer. He said, you're sure? She said, I'm 70% sure. She said, which is more sure than I've been about anything in this investigation in 6 months. He said, that's worth testing. She said, yes. She said, our head of engineering is going to need to build a load test that replicates peak production volume with the specific category combinations. She said, that's a week of work. He said, do you know what the threshold is? She said, no. He said, you need the thermal probe equivalent. He said, something that tells you when the mapper is under stress before it fails. She said, a performance monitor. He said, something that watches the mapper's response time under load and logs it. He said, you'll see the response time spike before the failure. He said, that tells you the threshold. She said, yes. She said it with the quality of someone for whom things were arriving correctly after a long time of arriving incorrectly. She said, that's the approach. He said, you'll need someone who can look at the mapper without expecting it to be fine. Someone who goes in with the assumption that it might fail rather than the assumption that it tests correctly. She said, someone who isn't a Ferrari specialist. He said, someone who's looking for the thing instead of confirming what they know. She looked at him. She said, would you consult? He said, on payment processing systems? She said, on the approach. She said it directly. She said, you just described the methodology that 6 months of specialists missed. You described it in a conversation on a porch in a 40-minute drive. She said, I don't need you to know payment processing. She said, I need someone who knows how to look for a problem rather than confirm a diagnosis. She said, that's a different skill and it's rarer than the domain expertise. He said, I fix cars. She said, you find failures in systems by understanding the logic of the failure rather than testing the components the diagnostic indicates. She said, that skill is not specific to cars. You just demonstrated it in a 40-minute conversation about payment processing. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the garage. He looked at the Ferrari in the garage. He said, my rate for the car.
She said, I'll pay your rate for the car. She said, double. She said, and a consulting rate for the organizational problem if you're willing to try. He said, I'd need to understand the architecture. She said, I'll send you the documentation. She said, read it the way you looked at the Ferrari. She said, without expecting to find anything specific. She said, just look at the systems and tell me where the logic of the failure pattern points. He said, it might not point anywhere useful. She said, it might not. She said it honestly. She said, but 6 months of specialists pointing at the components have gotten me to 2 lost clients and 6 more weeks before the third. She said, not pointing at the components and looking at the interfaces got you to a theory about the mapper in 40 minutes. She said, the expected value of a different approach is higher than the expected value of more of the same. He said, that's an engineer's argument. She said, I built a financial technology company. She said, the argument is in my operating system.
She looked at him. She said, Nathan. He said, yeah. She said, what does Sophie want to be? He said, she changes weekly. He said it with the expression he wore when he was reporting Sophie's current phase. He said, this week she wants to be a marine biologist. He said, last week it was an astronaut. He said, the week before that she wanted to run a restaurant because she felt the dessert menus at most restaurants were inadequate. She said, she has opinions about dessert menus. He said, she has opinions about everything. He said it with the affection that was always there when he talked about her. He said, she told me last month that most cars are over-engineered and underappreciated. He said, she heard me say something about it once and she kept it. She said, she hears what you say. He said, she hears everything. He said, it's occasionally uncomfortable. She said, what did you tell her about the Ferrari? He said that a person had a car that wasn't working right and other people had looked at it and couldn't find the problem and I was going to try. He said, she asked what was wrong with it. He said, I didn't know yet. He said, she said, well, that's the first step. She said, she's 7. He said, she's been hearing me talk about problems since she was old enough to understand sentences. He said, she understands that the first step is knowing you don't know the answer yet. He said, most adults don't get that far. She said, most adults come in with the answer. He said, most adults come in with the answer and then find the evidence that confirms it. He said it looking at the Ferrari in the garage. He said, that's the problem the shops had. He said, they came in knowing what Ferrari failures looked like, and they found what they were looking for. He said, they were very thorough about finding the wrong thing. She said, and you came in not knowing. He said, I came in with a pattern. He said, and I followed where the pattern went. He fixed the fuel pump driver module that afternoon. It took 2.5 hours. He had sourced the part the previous week when she had first called him, on the theory that if the theory was right, he should have it available, and the part was in his tool chest, in the labeled spot he had designated for it. He replaced the module, ran the car on the lift for 45 minutes under simulated load, and watched the thermal readings stay within spec throughout. He drove it on Route 70 for another 45 minutes. No failure, no spike. The module ran at 91 degrees, 3 degrees under spec, clean. He drove back to the house at 3:20. Sophie was going to be out of school in 10 minutes. He had planned this correctly, which he always planned correctly because planning pickups correctly was non-negotiable. Vivian was still there. She had been working at the table on his porch with her laptop and her phone and the composure of someone conducting a normal workday in an unusual location and finding it functional. She looked up when he pulled the Ferrari in. He said, test drive was clean. He said, 45 minutes on Route 70, module stayed at 91. He said, it's fixed. She said, I know. She said it looking at the car. She said, I know it's fixed. He said, how? She said, because I've been watching you work for 3 hours, and the way you work tells you the result before the test confirms it. She said it with the quality of someone who had been paying attention in a specific way for 3 hours. She said, you move like someone who has already found the answer and is confirming it. She said, the uncertainty was this morning. She said, the certainty arrived at 38 minutes on Route 70. He said, that's a fair description. She said, I've been doing this for 6 months. She said, I've watched 3 audit firms and 3 technology consultants come in and move like people who were still finding the uncertainty. She said, the answer hadn't arrived for any of them. She said, in you, it arrived this morning. He said, the pattern pointed clearly once I drove it.
She said, yes. She said, I want you to read the architecture documentation. She said, I want to see if the pattern points clearly for you and ours. He said, I'll read it tonight. She said, tonight. He said, after Sophie's in bed. He said, 9 o'clock. He said, I'll read it and I'll tell you by Friday what I think the pattern suggests. He said, I might be wrong. He said, the mapper might not be the module, but the pattern points there and I should follow it and see. She said, that's all I'm asking. She said it with the quality of someone who had reduced their requirements to the minimum and found the minimum to be enough. He sent her the invoice before she left. The rate was what he had quoted on the phone, which was the rate he charged, no adjustment for complexity or difficulty, and the 4 months of prior failure. He had quoted the rate before he knew the complexity. The rate was the rate. He did not revise rates after the fact in either direction. She looked at it. She said, this is your rate? He said, yes. She said, for a job that stumped 4 shops and 6 specialists? He said, for fixing a fuel pump driver module. He said, that's what I did. He said, the finding was the hard part. He said, the fixing was the normal part. He said, I don't charge for the findings separately. She said, why not? He said, because the finding is how I know what to fix. He said, you can't separate them. They're the same job. She said, most people would. He said, I'm not most people. He said it without vanity, as a simple, true thing about himself that he had known long enough to state without performance. She paid the invoice. She got in the black SUV. The flatbed truck had already gone. She lowered the window. She said, Nathan. He said, yeah. She said, the mapper. He said, I'll follow the pattern. She said, I know. She said it with the specific certainty of someone who had been uncertain for 6 months and found in 4 hours someone who made the uncertainty look different. She said, that's why I'm leaving the Ferrari with you for another week. He said, the Ferrari is fixed. She said, I know. She said, I want Sophie to drive it. He said, Sophie is 7. She said, in the driveway. She said, at 1 mile per hour. She said, with me there. She was quiet for exactly 2 seconds, which was the time it took to process information of this magnitude. Then she said, I need to call Mom. He said, you can call Mom when we get home. She said, she needs to know about Saturday. He said, she'll find out about Saturday. She said, she needs to know now. This is important. He drove home with his daughter, calling her mother on the phone to inform her that she was going to drive a Ferrari on Saturday, 1 mile per hour, in the driveway, and that everyone needed to be aware of this in advance because it was important information that people in her life should have. He thought about the mapper. He thought about the pattern. He thought about a problem that had the same shape from 2 different directions and what it meant to follow the logic rather than confirm the diagnosis. He thought about Sophie at 1 mile per hour in a Ferrari in the driveway and what she was going to say about the exhaust note. He thought it was going to be a very good Saturday. If this story found you today, share it with someone who looks for the thing instead of confirming what they already know. Subscribe for a brand new story every single week. We will see you next time.